Okay, so before we get started, I have the longest list of disclaimers and content warnings that I need you to know about before going into this video. That's a slight exaggeration, but I do have a couple of things I want to mention before we get cracking on the topic of today's video, and one is the most important, which is the content warning, and that's to make sure you're aware before you watch this video that there is going to be a lot of discussion of sexual violence. Now, if today is not the day for you to hear about that or think about that or discuss that, then please don't feel like you need to watch this video. Take care of yourself. You can come back at a later date if you feel you can. So just be forewarned that that's what you're getting into with this video. And secondly is my disclaimer, shall we say, which is that I really want to make it clear from the offset of this video that if you enjoy Hades and Persephone retellings, whether you enjoy writing them, reading them, or both, I am not criticising you in this video. I think it is wonderful that people enjoy reading and writing retellings of Greek and classical mythology. That is a wonderful thing. It gets people really enthused about the subject. It can often do really interesting things in terms of exploring modern day themes and topics. And you know, if what you're consuming doesn't harm or hurt anyone else, then have at it, enjoy yourself. Literature is for enjoyment in lots and lots of cases, so there's nothing wrong with that. What I want to talk about in this video is the fact that the most popular version of the Hades and Persephone tale, the romantic story of a couple madly in love, a young woman who often brings a brooding young man out of his shell, or who escapes an overbearing mother to reign the underworld, is a modern invention. It is not rooted in the ancient sources, and it is not a version of the myth that the ancient Greeks, as far as we can tell from the sources, knew about. In fact, the version that the ancient Greeks told time and time again is very much in contrast with that, and it is the story of an abduction, a woman who is taken against her will and tricked into remaining in the underworld with a man she did not choose for herself. And that's what I'm going to be exploring in today's video. So I think there's going to be two main portions. The first is going to be looking at the ancient texts and the ancient evidence and the ancient versions of this myth, and how this story was narrated and known by the ancient Greeks themselves, all of which are pretty consistent, and I might have to, you know, trample on some of your hopes and dreams when it comes to a more positive version of their romance existing in Antiquity, but that is something I've seen a lot of misinformation about online. And then in the second part of this video, I want to discuss a little bit more about how Hades and Persephone has become such a popular romantic tale in modern versions of the story, why we do that, why that is, when it happened, and potentially some of the pitfalls of that, which then I hope will lead to a really interesting discussion in the comment section down below. So without further ado, let's talk about how Hades and Persephone just aren't the cute couple that you think they are. First things first, who are Hades and Persephone? So Hades and Persephone are two very powerful and very important gods of ancient Greek religion. Hades is the god of the underworld and the ruler of the dead, whilst Persephone is the goddess of spring as well as the queen of the dead through marriage to Hades. Now, Hades specifically is from the generation of gods prior to Persephone. He is the son of the Titans Kronos and Rhea, as well as being the brother of Zeus, Poseidon, Demeter, Hera and Hestia. Meanwhile, Persephone is the daughter of Demeter and most commonly Zeus, which makes her of the generation below Hades as well as his niece. Now, that's not something I'm going to dive deep into in this video because marriage between relatives, particularly in Greek myth, is extremely common. Brothers and sisters get married all the time, and there is precedent in ancient Greek society for nieces and uncles marrying as well. Now, in terms of Hades and Persephone's children, the two aren't actually commonly cited as having any children together. Persephone is attributed a couple of different children, but usually with Zeus, her father, and Hades is sometimes attributed as the father of the Furies alongside Persephone, so that is the one set of children, shall we say, because they're a group of women through their marriage, but it's within very, very niche sources. So where you find the references to Hades and Persephone bearing children together, it's within the Orphic hymns. Now the Orphic hymns come from the Orphic mystery cult, which is one of a vast array of mystery cults that we know of from ancient Greece, but that we know very little of because they were mysteries. Like, they were mysterious in their day, not just now. And the versions of myths we get in the Orphic hymns are often quite niche, and the only versions of those myths that we get. They're not very common, they're later than a lot of the earlier versions of mythology, which doesn't invalidate them by any means, but it doesn't necessarily mean that a majority or even a large number of Greeks believed in what they said. And not only that, but even within the Orphic hymns, the Furies may have in fact been the children of Persephone and Zeus once again. So generally speaking, Hades in particular is not seen as a father figure in mythology, and that may be in part due to the fact that he is the god of death, and therefore as the god of death he is perceived as being infertile. Now that's not something that's super relevant to the topic of this video, but it might be something that you found interesting, so I thought I would mention it. Okay, so now that we know who Hades and Persephone are, let's talk about the myth of Persephone's abduction and her marriage to Hades. I've grabbed myself a little coffee for this part of the video. So first things first, I'm going to do like a brief narrative overview just to introduce you to the story before we look at some of the ancient texts and the language that they use. So when we get a more full account or a little bit more of an in-depth account of how Hades and Persephone came to be co-rulers of the underworld, it usually starts with Persephone in a field. So Persephone is in a field. Who she's in this field with varies, but it's usually other women, and they are gathering flowers, and she sees one flower in particular and goes to pick it up. She is drawn to this flower, so she goes to like pluck it from the ground, and when she does this, a tear in the earth opens up, a crack or earthquake takes place, and Hades rides up from the underworld through this crack in the earth on his carriage, his horse-drawn carriage, and basically swipes Persephone from the earth. He bundles her up, you know, he grabs her, he carries her away in his chariot and takes her down to the underworld. He doesn't speak to her before he does this, they haven't conversed before this, she isn't given a chance to respond to this, and all we hear is that she screams and calls out for help or assistance because she's being dragged away like this. We then have Persephone trapped in the underworld with Hades. She doesn't have the freedom to leave. She isn't able to just like go back and forth or do whatever she wants. She is trapped down there somewhere that she didn't actively choose to be trapped. And in the meantime, her mother Demeter is at a loss for what's happened to her daughter. All of a sudden her daughter has gone missing and nobody can seem to tell her what happened. She never heard her scream out, she didn't get a chance to respond to Hades' abduction, but now she is desperately searching the earth for Persephone. Finally, the other gods inform her, the ones that witnessed the abduction, that she was taken away by Hades. Now generally speaking, most of the time it is made clear that Zeus is quite happy with this. Like, he entirely approves of his daughter having been taken by Hades. He is quite happy for them to marry and like doesn't really have an issue with what his brother has done. Demeter on the other hand does. So when she learns what's happened and the fact that no one's just about to hand Persephone back to her or let her talk to her or explain the situation, she goes into a rage and she basically starts to like recall her power from the earth. Demeter is the goddess of the harvest, the goddess of agriculture, and without her assistance, humans are unable to farm or feed themselves or grow anything, and she can actively damage their ability to do that, as well as just like leaving them without the ability. So that's what she does. She wrecks the earth, she destroys crops, she rages and screams and demands that her daughter is returned to her. And no matter what Zeus himself says, she never backs down. She wants to talk to her daughter, she wants her daughter returned, she wants her daughter's freedom. Now, a few other things do happen in between. Greek myth is never like a very straightforward point A to point B, and Demeter does end up at one point getting taken in by a human family and raising a baby, and like it's this whole thing. But that's not necessarily relevant to Hades and Persephone's story. So eventually Zeus realizes that Demeter is not about to back down. She is insistent, she is strong-willed, and she is going to basically destroy humanity, which not something Zeus is keen on. Like, you know, he's invested in humans at this point. They make sacrifices to him. He's like interested in keeping them around. So he sends Hermes down to the underworld. Hermes is the messenger god to retrieve Persephone. He sends Hermes to bring Persephone back to Earth. He certainly moves away from his original stance of like, take her and keep her and I don't care. Like, he backs out of that agreement. Don't know exactly like what his long-term plan was, but he says that Hades needs to release Persephone and send her back to her mother. That is like the essential part there. Now, when Hermes approaches Hades, Hades is disgruntled, like this isn't the plan, this isn't what he wanted. He wants to keep Persephone, but he also knows that he can't go against Zeus. Zeus is the king of the gods, he's in charge, he's going to have to relinquish the woman that he wants in his home. So recognising that he's going to have to, you know, send Persephone back up to the land of the living, the overworld, shall we call it. That's not what the ancient Greeks called it. But he goes to Persephone in her chambers, wherever they are in the underworld, and explains to her that he will be sending her back up there. And he leaves her with the thought that even though she's going back up there to see her mother, she should consider him as a match, that he is very appealing, that he has a lot to offer, that she can rule alongside him, that she'll be in charge of the dead, that she can offer a lot, and like tries to sell himself, you know. He basically writes himself a dating profile at this point. After the abduction, he thinks, okay, I don't want to lose her, so maybe I'll now try and endear myself. Here's all the reasons that you should want to marry her. Persephone doesn't react to this. Instead, she's just so thrilled to be going home to see her mother again. And this is the emotion that we see her express in the text. She is very happy at this news. Now, this could be the moment of redemption for Hades, but it's not, because out comes a pomegranate. And I think it's very important to make clear at this point that all of the mentions of the pomegranate we have, where there is any like background given to Persephone eating this pomegranate in the ancient sources, it's made clear that she did not know what eating the pomegranate would do. Because something I see a lot online and when I'm having discussions around this myth is people insisting that because Persephone ate the pomegranate, she wanted to stay in the underworld. However, in the ancient text, it is made clear that through giving her the pomegranate seeds, Hades is tricking her, that he does it secretively, and that she doesn't know what eating the pomegranate will mean. She's just so thrilled to be going home. Now, I'm talking about this as if you know exactly what happens at this point, but you might not. So what happens is Hades gets his pomegranate. You know, he gets some of the seeds looking very tasty and scrumptious and gives them to Persephone to eat before she goes up to see her mother. But Hades is doing something very intentional at this point. He's not just giving her a snack. He knows that when Persephone eats these seeds, she will be forever bound to the underworld and she will have to return to it. So Persephone eats these seeds. In some instances, it just seems as if she takes them and eats them, and in other instances, it references that he forced her to eat them. So when Persephone then returns to the world above to see her mother asks her if she ate anything while she was down there. She knows as well as Hades does that if Persephone ate something, that will tie her to the underworld. And it's at this moment that it all comes out that Hades tricked or forced Persephone into eating seeds that would bind her to the underworld, and naturally she and her mother both expressed devastation over this fact. Now, Zeus doesn't want everything to go back to the way it was when Persephone was first abducted, so a deal is stricken. From this point on, it is agreed that Persephone will spend 1/3 of every year in the underworld with Hades as his wife, and she will spend the other 2/3 of the year in the land of the living with her mother. So this is sort of where the like dual facets of Persephone come into play. We have her as the goddess of the spring. She spends the warmer fertile months in the land of the living, where she spends the colder wintry months in the underworld. And in effect, that is the myth of Hades and Persephone's abduction. It is predominantly used to explain the sort of seasonal changes and like agricultural year. That is like a large part of what it serves in Greek mythology, but the details are clear and it is made very, very obvious throughout the sources that Persephone did not choose to go to the underworld. And on that note, I'm going to read to you some of the sources themselves, as well as discuss some of the ancient Greek language that is used. So the fullest account we have of this myth is also one of the earliest accounts we have of this myth, which is the Homeric hymn to Demeter. So this is my little Oxford University Press translation of the Homeric hymns, including the Homeric hymn to Demeter. For context, these poems were not written by Homer. They were originally attributed to Homer, but it's long been established that they were not written by Homer. They were written by a selection of different poets, but they are from a similar time period, the archaic era which Homer was writing in. So one of the hymns, as I mentioned, is the hymn to Demeter, and I'm not going to read you the whole thing because it is long, like so long. You can read it yourself if you're interested, and I will link it in the description box down below. But I do want to highlight a few sentences and passages. So at the very beginning of this poem, we're told the story of how Hades abducts Persephone, and this is what it says. She, being struck with wonder, reached out with both her hands to grasp this beautiful plaything, aka the flower. But broad-pathed earth gaped wide on the Nisaean plain where the Lord, the receiver of many, that's a reference to Hades, rushed forth with his deathless horses, Kronos' son, who has many a name. He seized her against her will and aboard his golden car carried her off, lamenting. She uttered a piercing scream in appeal to her father, Kronos' son, the highest and the best. But there was not any amongst the immortals or mortal men who heard her call. Although it then goes on to say that Hecate and Helios, the goddess of witchcraft and the god of the sun, did hear her. So two people heard her. Then the text goes on to say that against her will, her father's brother carried her off. Meanwhile, the goddess viewed earth and the starry sky and the strong flowing sea, teeming with fish and the rays of the sun. She still hoped to behold her dear mother again and the tribes of gods eternal in race. So long did hope soothe her mighty mind despite her grief. So what we witness there is Persephone hoping that her mother is going to come to save her and that they won't be parted. Then we get into the adventures of Demeter and what she gets up to while Persephone is in the underworld. Until we get to the point in the story where Zeus concedes to have Hermes go to the underworld and bring back Persephone and return her to her mother. So then we witness Hades approaching Persephone with this news. Go, Persephone, now to your dark-robed mother's side, keeping within your breast your temper and spirit mild, and be in no way despondent too much in excess of the rest, for amongst the immortals you'll find that I am no unsuitable spouse, being Father Zeus's own brother. Going there you'll rule over all that lives and moves amidst the immortals. You'll have honours of greatest worth, and vengeance forever will come upon those who act unjustly and fail to appease your heart, by performing your offerings piously, paying you fitting gift. In this way he spoke, to the joy of Persephone shrewd in thought. She quickly leapt up in delight, but secretly glancing round he gave her to eat a pomegranate's honey sweet seed, so that there by revered Demeter the dark-robed she would not forever stay. So we then witness Hades and Persephone return to the land of the living, and Demeter asks Persephone what happened whilst she was in the underworld. Mother, for you I shall indeed recount the whole truth. When the speedy slayer of Argos' messenger came to me from the father, Kronos' son, and the rest of the heavenly gods, and passed on the news that he bore, that from Erebos I was to go, in order that you, on seeing me, might desist from the wrath and the dreadful rage that you nurture against the immortal gods. I at once leapt in delight, but Hades secretly put a food as sweet as honey, a pomegranate seed, in my hand, and using violence forced me to taste it against my will. Then she follows up this story of how she was forced to eat the pomegranate seed with how she was originally abducted. He bore me away in his golden chariot under the ground, though much against my will, and I uttered a piercing cry in these words for you. I've spoken, despite my grief, the whole truth. So the kind of language that we encounter in that hymn has a lot to do with like violence and force and deception and secrecy and of course abduction. And that's not the only text in which this kind of language is used. Most commonly throughout the ancient Greek texts, Hades' actions are described as an abduction. Specifically, the ancient Greek word that is used is the different forms of arpaxo. So arpaxo is a word that means to seize, to abduct, to capture, or to overpower. It's a word rooted in violence that refers to something being done against the will of the person being taken. It is not a consensual word, and that is very, very clear throughout the ancient Greek texts that use this word, not just in the stories of Hades and Persephone. And some of the other authors who use this terminology include Apollodorus, Diodorus Siculus, Hesiod, the oldest reference to the abduction of Hades and Persephone that potentially predates the Homeric hymn to Demeter, and also Pausanias, to name a few. There are no references to this incident which portray it consensually. You do have brief references to the fact that Hades and Persephone are married without any details about how this came to be, but when we hear about their meeting, about the beginning of their marriage, it is always referred to as an abduction. It is always portrayed as something that's against Persephone's will. Now, one common comment I've received in response to pointing this aspect of the myth out is the fact that her father approves. Now, that might also be what comes to your mind when you think about this move. Her father approves of this marriage. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that just because her father approves, or just because a marriage is arranged, as it may very well have been in like the realities of ancient women's lives, does not mean Persephone was on board. And I think it's very clear from the text that Persephone was opposed to what was happening to her. She did not go to the underworld consensually. And that is something that will have happened to ancient Greek women. They will have ended up in forced marriages. They will have ended up in relationships that they didn't want to end up in. But that does not make a consensual relationship. And arguing that simply because this is something that happened to ancient women and simply because her father approved makes it okay, erases the experiences of ancient women. It's also far too easy to argue or imply that this is just what ancient Greece was like. They were totally okay with these kind of things, because ancient Greece is not a homogenous society. What we think of ancient Greece today was made up of numerous different states with different laws and different legal bodies and different political systems and different approaches to marriage. So another argument I've heard a lot levied against the consensual interpretation of the Hades and Persephone myth is that the Greeks all abducted their brides anyway. This was a common marriage practice, when it wasn't actually that common. So the idea of bride kidnapping, where effectively a kidnapping is staged between husband and wife, is something that comes from Spartan society. So it's something we see referenced in texts, the idea that the Spartans had these ceremonies and these practices where women waited in dark rooms for men to come and grab them on their wedding night, and this was what was expected. But Sparta is actually quite a unique case. This isn't something that was common of all Greek city-states, and from what we see or know about marriage in other Greek city-states, this is not a practice that's done elsewhere. It's very much rooted in like the warlike characteristic and upbringing of Spartan people and the way that they structure their society. Conversely, we actually have evidence for a lot of ancient Greek laws and societal attitudes that were very, very much opposed to sexual violence. Now, just because a society or a culture or a city is ideologically opposed to something doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Sexual violence is illegal in the UK today, but that doesn't mean we don't still live in a rape culture or that women don't still experience sexual violence. But it's not something that was outwardly approved on. The ancient Greeks were not just running around and abducting people as their legitimate wives. Now, they were enslaving people and they were sexually assaulting people. That is true. But that doesn't cover the relationship we see depicted in the Hades and Persephone myth. And we do see a lot of sexual violence in Greek myth. We see the gods constantly doing sexually violent acts. But that doesn't mean that the ancient Greeks thought that was like cool. They just recognised that their gods did things without repercussions, that they had so much power that they could do things that ordinary mortals were not supposed to do. Their gods didn't have to be perfect. Their gods weren't even morally superior. They were just all-powerful beings that you had to respect in order to live like a safe and happy life in ancient Greek society. So I really do despise the argument that it's consensual because that's just how things were done in ancient Greece. The texts acknowledge Persephone's grief. They acknowledge Persephone's discomfort and anger and sadness at what has happened to her, and I think it's wrong to dismiss that when looking at the ancient evidence. In Gortyn on Crete, for example, we have evidence of their law scriptures which tell us point blank women could choose their own husbands. Wrong to speak of ancient Greece as a homogenous society which all uses the same laws and the same practices. And on top of that, we have evidence from Gortyn, from Athens, and from elsewhere that women could divorce their husband. So although the ancient Greek concept of consent isn't necessarily the same as our concept of consent, they are not like caricatures. They're complex people who had varying attitudes to different things, and their women would have had their own experiences and reactions and emotions to the events that were happening around them. So yeah, those are my thoughts on that topic. Can you tell that I've had to explain this numerous times before? I've uploaded a few TikToks over on TikTok in the past where I've talked about this myth and how there aren't any ancient versions that portray it as a consensual partnering up, where I've then received a lot of backlash from people who don't want to acknowledge that or who are convinced it's otherwise. And don't get me wrong, a lot of those comments do not come from a malicious place. They are basing their understanding on things they've read online or on retellings they've read, but that haven't provided ancient evidence and that are perpetuating a misinterpretation or a misunderstanding of the myth. So where did some of these misunderstandings begin? I actually think it's really interesting because there is one example in particular where we can pinpoint the sort of popularization of one misconception around Persephone in general, or at least an interpretation of the Persephone myth that there isn't any ancient evidence for. And that is the book The Lost Goddesses of Early Greece by Charlene Spretnek. Now, this book came out in 1978, and I actually really admire certain elements of Spretnek's intention with this book. One of the things she's trying to address in this book is the patriarchal structures of both antiquity and previous scholarship, which is something I greatly admire. Like, it's something that I did a lot of in my own PhD thesis, was trying to break down a lot of the like misogynistic, sexist misconceptions we had about certain topics and discuss and explore things that had been overlooked because of how they were related to women in particular. So that, like, I'm super on board with. However, one thing that this book does is then imagine myths that there's no evidence for, or that are entire narratives based on like one potential thing. What Spretnek does in her version of the Persephone tale is tell a story of how Persephone is conversing with her mother and they're talking about the dead and like who's in charge of the dead and how the dead are all alone in the underworld and they need someone to watch over them, and how Persephone says to her mother, I would like to go and be their goddess, and she then wanders around and locates the entrance to the underworld where she travels down and becomes their queen. This is not a version of the story where you see Hades as her husband, but it is a version of the story I see a lot of people repeating. So one of the most common one comment I got a lot on some of my previous TikToks was, isn't there a version of the myth where Persephone wanders into the underworld? Now, one that has sort of been taken and misconstrued and then applied to the Hades and Persephone myth, where some people seem to think that Persephone wanders into the underworld and meets Hades and they live happily ever after. And two, some people have then sort of been led to believe that this is an ancient version of the myth, but it is Spretnek's version. There's no like basis for this story. This is like a nice story that she wrote. It's like an interesting story, it's like a fun story, it's like interesting, but it's not an ancient story. Persephone, or as she's otherwise known, Kore, is a goddess of death and has for a long time been a goddess of death, and there are references to her being a goddess of death before she's ever referenced as the wife of Hades. So yes, many cultures will have worshipped versions of Persephone Kore as a goddess of death, but the story of how she became goddess of death or how she ended up in the underworld as Persephone is something we don't know. Like, there's just like no versions of that from any ancient culture. Like, we don't have that. Spretnek just made it up. And I get that Spretnek was just like following her imagination and her enthusiasm for breaking down the patriarchal structures of classics to imagine possible myths of the past, but they are just imagined. Like, there is no evidence for them, and I feel like I keep repeating that, but like, it's really important to acknowledge, because we cannot, with any good faith, say that that story is a story that any ancient people believed in. And it definitely is not evidence of a consensual relationship between Hades and Persephone. So if that's a version that you've heard wandering around the internet or repeated by someone in your life, there you go, now you know where it came from. So I think that discussion brings us solidly into the topic of modern day interpretations and retellings of the Hades and Persephone myth. Now, I'm going to repeat myself here, but I do want to make it clear that I am not criticising anyone for enjoying these retellings or writing these retellings. Have at it. Do what you will. The issue, predominantly for me as an ancient historian, is when that interpretation or that version of a story gets backdated and placed upon ancient people. Myths have been reinterpreted and retold since their very conception. The ancient Greeks were quite happy to reinterpret and retell and adjust and adapt their myths. This happens. There are different versions of myths from different parts of Greece. We don't have a consensual version of Hades and Persephone, but myth is a changing form, and that is absolutely valid. But myth is also a really important source when it comes to understanding ancient people, specifically ancient Greek in this instance, their culture, their ideologies, their attitudes, and other aspects of their life and their society. So when people start to backdate modern interpretations of a myth to ancient people, it encourages a misunderstanding of ancient civilizations. And sexual violence and mythology and rhetoric and attitudes to women are some of my expertise as an ancient historian, and I so very much value myth and the way myths are told by different texts as a source for how we understand antiquity. So I think it's really important not to get confused with what are ancient versions of stories and what are modern versions of stories, because it, like I mentioned, encourages a misunderstanding of ancient people. And I'm sure that is not the intention of most people who write a consensual love story between Hades and Persephone. They're just having fun, and I totally get that. I'm a sucker for a Beauty and the Beast retelling, which has a lot of its own like problematic aspects. Like, we're just having fun reading books, right? And that's totally okay. But something I do see occasionally from authors, from readers, and from publishers is a subtle or explicit implication that this version of the story is somehow a more accurate version of the story than the one we already know. That it is rooted in long misunderstood and long lost ancient texts. And that adds to this misunderstanding, right? Like, this adds to the popular misconception that the consensual Hades and Persephone love story is an ancient story. And that's presumably also why I got some very like vitriolic abuse on some of my videos about Hades and Persephone on TikTok in the past. Like, people were really angry at me for just pointing out the fact that this is not originally a love story. And I don't know what to do with that, because I don't want to take something away from people that means a lot to them. I just want people to acknowledge that it's not an ancient thing, that it's a modern thing. That's all I'm asking for. And that's all other ancient historians are asking for, who've also written about and talked about this topic. But now that I've hopefully thoroughly established what we know of the ancient Hades and Persephone, I do want to muse a little bit more on the modern Hades and Persephone, because I think that's a very interesting topic in itself. Not just the fact that it's changed, but the fact that this is such a popular reinterpretation. And I mean popular. You might know that I steadily update a database I have on my website of Greek and Roman myth retellings from different authors in different formats and different genres, from children's books to poetry to adult books to short story collections. And I like to link to those books and give you a reference point for what myths they retell in case you're looking for a specific myth retelling, including Hades and Persephone. And Hades and Persephone is like the #1 retold myth, aside from, say, the Trojan War. Hades and Persephone, from my experience, seems to be like the most retold Greek myth, and it is almost exclusively retold as a love story. That's the version of Hades and Persephone that seems to be the most popular. And I say seems to because I'm not implying my database is in any way like an exhaustive piece of research that has collected all of the possible data on this, but that's just like a pattern I've noticed. Now, you probably gathered already that like Hades and Persephone is not my retelling, it's not the one I love to read, like it doesn't click with me, but like I said, I love me a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and there's nothing wrong with enjoying either, that's grand. But I do find it really interesting. Like, I find this phenomenon really interesting. Even though I don't love reading them, I find it very interesting how popular they are. And I find it very interesting that that has sort of contributed to this idea that that's the version, or at least that's the only version I see retold, because I've never read a Hades and Persephone retelling that explores Persephone's trauma at being abducted, or Persephone's experience of being forced to marry a man that she doesn't want to marry, and I would love to read that. It doesn't mean all the other ones have to be deleted or stop being written, but like, could somebody write one of those? And if you know of like a sort of niche retelling that I've never heard of which does do this, please tell me, because I think that would be really interesting, because I think that could be a wonderful vehicle to explore sexual violence and trauma through an ancient myth for modern readers. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about myth, especially as modern day retellings, is it can explore these themes and these topics that still affect us today. And that's not to say that the consensual versions don't have important themes embedded in them, but I do wonder why no one ever chooses to use this as a narrative to explore trauma. And interestingly enough, I do want to mention two retellings here, which again, I'm not shading if you like, but I do want to like look at abstractly, because they both do something really interesting that I struggle to wrap my brain around. And that's because both of these books, which are Lore Olympus, a graphic novel series that started off as a webtoon, and The Dark Wife, which is a sapphic retelling of Hades and Persephone where they are in a consensual relationship. Both of these books actually do a really, really good job of exploring the trauma of sexual violence and the threat of sexual violence and sexism. Like, both of these books do that, and they do it well, the authors do it well, but both of them do it through the sexual assault or the attempted sexual assault of Persephone by another god. So there are spoilers here for both these books. So in Lore Olympus, the aggressor is Apollo, and in Dark Wife, the representation of like sexual violence and misogyny is Zeus. Meanwhile, we see a healthy consensual relationship portrayed between Hades and Persephone, whether like in The Dark Wife Hades is a woman or in Lore Olympus he remains a man. And I find it very, very interesting, and something I'd love to know your thoughts on, that a myth about sexual violence, a myth about abduction, a myth about a girl who is taken from her family, who is grieving the loss of her family, and who is tricked by a partner or forced into marriage, is being used to explore the trauma of sexual violence and misogyny, but that erases the original attacker. Like, if we're going to use these characters as a vehicle to explore those emotions and those experiences and those themes, why erase the original attacker and replace him or her, and instead turn them into a positive character? And one of the things I see levied a lot in discussions around the Hades and Persephone myth is that these are feminist retellings because they give Persephone back her strength and her choices. But is it feminist to erase women's trauma and to erase the experiences of sexual violence? Persephone is no less a strong, powerful woman and goddess because she's also the survivor of abduction and potentially sexual assault. Like, she can be a strong feminist figure while still having experienced that specifically. And that's why I don't love when people imply that in order for Persephone to be a feminist character, she needs to fall in love with Hades and it needs to be a consensual story. It's not to say that it's wrong to retell it that way and that you can't write a feminist version of the story like that, but the original isn't less feminist because she is attacked. act. I don't think that's a great thing to imply, and that's something I have talked a lot about with other scholars and ancient historians who are also women and who are also women and who are also people who have experienced sexual violence and abuse in their own life, who feel like this woman's experiences of sexual violence are being erased in modern popular culture and being forgotten about, when in fact there's nothing wrong with being a survivor, and Persephone is an incredibly strong woman and she can be respected as both a survivor and she can be seen as both of those things. She is both of those things, and those two things are not oxymorons of one another. And I do think these are really important things to discuss. It doesn't mean we do away with the modern day retellings that romanticize their story. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with liking those versions, but I think it's also important to just like analyze and discuss why we're doing it, and also why it might be important to see the other side of things and to make sure we're remembering the ancient version of Persephone at the same time. Because harkening back to what we talked about earlier in this video, that women would have certainly been married off to men that they didn't want to be married to in antiquity, there is a story there. There is a story about like a patriarchal society of forced marriage and a woman's experience of that. That story exists, and it's important not to erase that. And this brings me to the final topic I want to discuss in this video, which is Demeter. So I haven't dwelled too much on Demeter so far because this video is about Hades and Persephone, and that's what you're here to learn about. But you can't ignore Demeter in this narrative. Demeter changes the story. It's Demeter that is the reason that Persephone even gets to return to the land of the living at all. It's Demeter that is the reason Persephone gets to split her time across both worlds. It's Demeter who fights for her daughter. And this story is, this myth is actually one of the reasons why I love Demeter so much as a goddess. I think Demeter is such an incredibly strong character, goddess and woman. Demeter is determined. Demeter perseveres. Demeter is loving and strong and brash, and she doesn't back down, and she doesn't allow others to silence her. She's protective, and she stands before the king of the gods himself and proves to him how powerful she is and how necessary she is, and uses that power to save her daughter. Now obviously there's the compromise, there's the fact that Persephone does marry Hades and she does have to go back to the underworld for a third of every year, but if it weren't for Demeter that would never have happened. Therefore my biggest pet peeve in Hades and Persephone retellings is the transformation of Demeter into an overbearing, almost sometimes abusive mother figure. Like, you can convince me that writing a Hades and Persephone consensual loving retelling is a-okay, wonderful, can be done really well, but you cannot convince me that portraying Demeter in this way is fair. And it's something I see a lot of, and it's something I then also see backdated as an argument for why Hades and Persephone are a consensual love story. So again, comments I've received in the past during these discussions on this myth is that Persephone had to pretend it was non-consensual in order to escape her mother. And that story exists. There will be women out there who have done this. There will be women out there who have run away from abusive parents, who have run away with partners whose parents have then implied that the partner abducted them against their will. That narrative exists. But it's not the narrative of Persephone, Demeter and Hades in the ancient myth. It doesn't exist in the ancient evidence. And sure, we can all sit here and say there are myths that don't survive, there are texts that don't survive, anything could have existed, but in that same regard there could be a version of the Hades and Persephone myth where Persephone is a goat and the goat abducts Hades and makes him the god of mushrooms. Like, you can make an argument for anything having existed if we don't have evidence for it. But in reality, we don't have a version of the Hades and Persephone myth where Persephone runs away from home because she doesn't want to be with her mum but wants to be with Hades. That doesn't exist. And it just makes me really sad that in supposedly feminist versions of this myth that are being retold today, a strong mother figure who protects her child, another strong woman, is done so dirty and instead made the villain, and the man who originally abducts the woman becomes the hero. And on a personal level, just like from my personal perspective, that doesn't feel very radical or feminist. It doesn't excite me, it doesn't like inspire me. It actually just kind of makes me a little bit sad. So yeah, that basically brings me to the end of this discussion. I've been sitting here for 2 hours filming. Goodness only knows how long the final video that you've just watched has ended up to. Well done if you've made it to the end. I'm hoping that you have lots of thoughts and are excited to share them and chat more in the comments. Please be polite and respectful. I know how passionate people can get about this topic. Meanwhile, if you're interested in watching some more videos about antiquity, some more video essays on women of antiquity especially, then I do have more on my channel, including videos on Medusa, on made-up goddesses of Tumblr, on Hera and Disney, etc, etc, that I will link in the description box down below. And I hope that you'll enjoy them and that you enjoyed this video. But until next time, happy reading, happy learning, and I'll see you all again in the next one. Bye everyone!